I write this in the year of our Lord 453, in the tongue of the Romans, though I am a Goth by birth and a slave by station. My name is Jordanes. I have witnessed the death of the world's terror, and I set these words to parchment before the memory corrupts with legend, before truth drowns in the sea of rumor. I am no free man. My hands bear the scars of iron shackles worn smooth over years of service. But I possess what few in this savage court can claim: the gift of letters, the ability to speak the tongues of 5 peoples. 3 days passed. Attila the Hun, Scourge of God, terror of the world, died choking on his own blood in a bridal chamber while his new wife watched. The manner of his death breeds whispers of murder. The Huns mourn with such violence that the very earth trembles. And I alone among the slaves have been commanded to write it down, to preserve for some distant age the truth of how the greatest conqueror since Alexander left this world. Let me begin where all stories of great men must, with how I came to stand in the presence of one who made emperors tremble. I was taken from my father's lands in the 4th year of Attila's sole reign. Our village burned. I remember the smoke rising black against a summer sky, the screams of women, the thunder of hooves. I was young then, perhaps 16 winters, and I had been schooled by a Roman priest. When the Huns discovered this, when they heard me pleading in broken Latin, they did not kill me. Instead, they dragged me in chains across the Danube, northward to this realm of felt tents and wooden halls. Attila needed interpreters. His empire stretched from the Rhine to the Volga, a patchwork of conquered peoples who spoke a babel of languages: Gothic, Gepedic, Sarmatian, Slavic, Latin, Greek. The Huns themselves had only recently begun to adopt written contracts, so I became a translator, a living bridge between worlds, standing at the elbow of the world's most feared man as he dictated threats to emperors and negotiated tributes with subject kings. I learned to watch his face for the flicker of rage that preceded executions, to modulate my voice to match his moods, to render his harsh Hunnic syllables into the flowering phrases Romans expected. I was property, no different than his horses or his golden plates, but property that heard secrets and saw the machinery of empire from within. The palace where Attila held court was not Rome or Constantinople. It was a sprawling compound of wooden buildings set on the plains near the Tisza river, surrounded by felt yurts that housed his warriors and their families. The main hall rose higher than the rest. Inside, the walls were hung with silk plundered from Persian caravans and tapestries torn from Gallic churches. The floor was packed earth, covered in furs and rushes that grew foul when the drinking grew heavy. It smelled always of smoke and horses and unwashed men, of fermented mare's milk and roasted meat and the leather that the Huns wore like a second skin. I slept in a low building behind the kitchens with other slaves, a Greek physician, Scythian grooms, a Roman engineer Attila kept to design siege weapons. We huddled together against the cold and spoke in whispers of the world beyond the Danube, wondering if we would ever see it again. In spring of this year, word came that Attila would take a new wife. He had many women already, Hunnic noblewomen who managed his household, foreign princesses kept as tokens of conquest. But this bride was different. Her name was Ildiko, and she was Gothic, like me. Beautiful, they said, pale-skinned with hair the color of wheat, barely 17 years old. Some whispered she was given as tribute by a client king seeking favor. Others claimed Attila had seen her during a raid and demanded her as prize. I never learned the full truth. I knew only that the king was pleased with this match, that he spoke of her with something approaching tenderness, rare enough to be remarked upon among the slaves, and that preparations for the wedding feast consumed the palace for weeks. The Huns did not marry as Romans did, with solemn vows and sacred rites. A wedding among the steppe peoples was cause for celebration, measured in days of drinking and feasting, in displays of horsemanship and strength, in the exchange of gifts and the singing of ancestral songs. Attila commanded that this wedding surpass all others. He was, after all, the ruler of the world's largest empire, the man who had humbled Rome itself and extracted tribute of 700 pounds of gold each year from the Eastern Emperor. What was expense to such a one? Guests began arriving a week before the wedding day, subject kings with their retinues, Hunnic nobles from distant camps, even a delegation of Gepids led by Ardaric, the king who was counted Attila's most trusted ally. I saw them all as I moved through the palace grounds, translating conversations, carrying messages, observing the careful dance of power and submission that governed relations between Attila and his vassals. The Gepid king I knew by sight, a tall man with a braided beard and eyes that betrayed intelligence. He had fought at Attila's side at the great battle on the Catalaunian plains 2 years earlier, where the Huns and their allies had clashed with the Romans and Visigoths in slaughter so vast that streams ran red and corpses choked the valleys. I had not been present for that battle. I had been left at the palace with the other non-combatants, but I had heard the warriors' tales when they returned. Attila spoke often of Catalaunian plains. It was his only defeat, a thing that rankled him still. He called it a test from the sky god, a reminder of mortal limits, but I could see it gnawed at him. Now, in this spring of 453, he seemed determined to put that shadow behind him with celebration and conquest of a different sort, the taking of a young and beautiful wife. The wedding day arrived with clear skies and warm winds from the south. The ceremony itself was brief. Attila and Ildiko stood before the shaman who chanted invocations to Tengri and the spirits of the steppe, who blessed the union with smoke from burning horsehair and herbs. I saw her from a distance, veiled in red silk, so small beside Attila's stocky frame. He was not tall, the Huns rarely were, but he radiated power, his barrel chest and thick arms testament to a lifetime of war and horsemanship. His face was weathered, scarred, his beard streaked with grey, though he was perhaps 50 winters old. Beside him, Ildiko looked like a captured bird. The feast that followed was debauchery on a scale that shocked even those of us accustomed to Hunnic excess. The great hall could not hold all the guests, so tables were set up in the open air, stretching across the compound in long rows. Whole sheep and cattle roasted on spits, slaves hauled amphora after amphora of wine, plundered from Gaul and Italia, and great leather skins of kumis, the fermented mare's milk that the Huns drank like water. I moved among the tables, translating toasts and jests, watching the celebration spiral into chaos as the sun tracked westward and the drinking intensified. Attila sat at the high table, Ildiko beside him, and he drank as I had never seen him drink before. Cup after cup of heavy red wine, horns of kumis drained in single draughts, while warriors cheered. His face flushed dark, his eyes grew glassy, but still he called for more. He toasted his sons, Elak the eldest, who sat glowering nearby, Dengizic and Ernak, younger and already half-drunk themselves. He toasted the subject kings, the warriors who had followed him across rivers and mountains, the gods who had granted him dominion over the earth. Between toasts, he would lean close to Ildiko and whisper things that made her blush and look away. I wondered what she felt in those moments, fear surely, and perhaps resignation. The smell in the hall was overwhelming, roasted meat and wood smoke, sour kumis and sweet wine, the sweat of 1,000 bodies packed close in the spring warmth. Torches guttered on the walls, casting wild shadows that danced across the carved beams overhead. Someone had brought out a harp, and a bard sang the old songs of Hunnic conquest, the raids on the Goths, the sacking of Roman cities, the rivers of gold that flowed into Attila's treasury. The warriors roared approval, pounding their fists on the tables until cups jumped and wine slopped over the edges. I stood near the wall, forgotten for the moment, and watched. There was something feverish about the celebration, something desperate. These men had followed Attila for 20 years, had grown rich on plunder and drunk on power, but they were not young anymore. The world was changing. Rome still stood, weakened but defiant. The Visigoths had proven themselves formidable at Catalaunian plains, and Attila himself was aging, his hair graying, his movements sometimes stiff when he thought no one watched. This wedding was an assertion of vitality, a declaration that the great days were not past, that the Scourge of God still commanded the earth and all upon it. As midnight approached, Attila rose unsteadily to his feet. The hall fell silent. He raised a cup, wine slopping over his knuckles, and declared in a voice thick with drink that he would retire with his bride. The warriors cheered, a roar that shook the rafters, and someone began a bawdy song about wedding nights that made even the hardened soldiers laugh. Attila took Ildico's hand. She stood trembling, her veil now pulled across her face, and led her from the hall toward the private chambers at the far end of the compound. I watched them go, weaving slightly. Attila's free hand braced against a doorpost for balance. Behind them, the celebration continued, growing louder and more chaotic as the restraint of the king's presence dissolved. I remained in the hall until the early hours, translating as needed, staying out of the way of drunk warriors who were as likely to strike a slave as embrace him in their cups. The Greek physician retired to our quarters, muttering about barbarism and the inevitable consequences of such excess. The Roman engineer had disappeared with one of the kitchen women. I finally slipped away as the sky began to pale in the east, exhausted, my ears ringing with the noise of celebration. I slept briefly on my pallet of straw, but was woken by shouting. It was full morning, the sun well risen, and something was wrong. I stumbled outside to find the compound in uproar. Warriors ran toward the king's chambers, weapons drawn, faces tight with alarm. I followed, my heart hammering, knowing with the instinct of the enslaved that catastrophe had fallen. The door to the bridal chamber was shut, and guards stood before it looking stricken. One of them, a scarred veteran named Attila, whom I knew by sight, was pounding on the wood and calling Attila's name. No answer came. I pushed close enough to hear the muttered conversation between the guards. They had waited all morning for the king to emerge, but noon had passed, and still the door remained closed. They had heard no sound from within. Finally, fearing some misfortune, they had begun to call out. Nothing. Attila looked at the others, then gestured. Together, they put their shoulders to the door and heaved. The wood splintered, and the door crashed inward. The smell hit first, blood and wine, and something fouler, the stink of death already beginning. I was close enough to see into the chamber, though I was not permitted to enter. The sight burned itself into my mind with terrible clarity. Attila lay on his back on the low bed, his face purple-black, his mouth open in a rictus of suffocation. Blood was everywhere, pooled beneath his head, soaked into the furs and linens, spattered on the floor. It had run from his nose and mouth, drenching his beard, staining his chest where it had flowed freely. His eyes were half open, glassy, staring at nothing. There was no wound upon him, no cut or stab, nothing to explain the gore that surrounded him. Beside the bed, huddled on the floor with her knees drawn to her chest, sat Ildico. Her wedding garments were stained with blood, not her own, for she bore no injury that I could see. And she was weeping silently, rocking back and forth like a mad woman. Her veil had fallen away, revealing a face pale as milk, eyes wide with shock. She did not look up when the door burst open, did not seem to register the presence of the guards who now filled the room. She only wept and rocked, her lips moving in some whispered prayer or plea that no one could hear. The guards stood frozen, staring at the impossible scene before them. Then Attila crossed himself, a curious gesture from a Hun, learned perhaps from Christian slaves, and whispered something in the Hunnic tongue that I did not catch. Around me, other warriors were crowding close, trying to see, and the whispers began like wind through dry grass. Murder. The bride killed him. Gothic treachery. Poison. Witchcraft. I felt ice in my veins, listening to those whispers. Ildico was Gothic, as was I. If they decided she had murdered the king, what would stop them from turning their rage on all Goths in the camp? I had seen Hunnic vengeance before. I had seen whole villages burned for the crimes of one man. The Greek physician pushed through the crowd, his healer's authority granting him passage where others hesitated. I followed in his wake, translating as he barked questions at the guards. He knelt beside the bed, examining Attila's corpse with careful hands, lifting the head, peering at the nose and mouth, pressing fingers to the cold flesh of the neck and chest. He worked in silence while we all watched. The only sound Ildico's quiet weeping and the shuffle of feet as more men arrived. Finally, the physician stood and wiped his hands on a cloth. He spoke in Greek first, to me, knowing I would understand, and I translated his words into Gothic, then into the halting Hunnic I had learned. "No wound," he said. "No mark of violence upon the body. The blood came from the nose. See here, the vessels burst. He choked on it. A man lying on his back, drunk beyond sense, bleeding from the nose. The blood runs down the throat instead of out. He drowned in it, unable to wake, unable to turn." The guards stared at him. One spat and said something harsh in Hunnic, that the Greek spoke lies to protect the Gothic witch. But Adeco silenced him with a gesture and asked through me whether such a thing was truly possible. The physician nodded gravely. "Entirely possible," he said. "I have seen it before, though rarely. A nosebleed is common enough. The dry air of the plains, the excessive drink, perhaps a weakness in the vessels from age or previous injury, lying flat, insensible from wine, unable to cough or turn. Yes, a man could drown in his own blood." He paused, then added, "The girl is covered in his blood because she was beside him when it happened, perhaps trying to rouse him when she woke and found him dying. She is in shock, not guilt." But I could see in the faces of the warriors that they were not convinced. They wanted a culprit, an enemy to strike, something to make sense of the senseless. How could the Scourge of God, the man who had defeated armies and terrorized empires, die from a nosebleed like some frail old woman? It was absurd, impossible, an insult to his memory. There must be treachery here, poison or sorcery, or a blade so cunningly used that it left no mark. I looked again at Ildico, still huddled on the floor, and I knew with cold certainty that her life hung by a thread. If Attila's sons decided she was to blame, no words from a Greek physician would save her. They carried Attila's body from the bridal chamber on a litter draped with silk, and the wailing began in earnest. I had witnessed Hunnic mourning before, when warriors died in battle, when children perished from fever, but never had I seen grief like this. It was not sorrow, as Romans or Goths understood it, all dignified tears and quiet prayer. This was rage and anguish given physical form, a violence turned inward that shocked even those of us who had lived years among these people. The warriors cut their faces with knives, dragging blades across cheeks and foreheads, until blood ran freely into their beards. They hacked at their hair with daggers, leaving ragged patches and tufts. Some tore at their garments, ripping fine silks and furs to shreds. The women screamed, high, ululating cries that pierced the morning air like the shrieks of hunting eagles. They beat their breasts and clawed at their arms until they bled, their voices rising and falling in waves of lamentation that seemed to have no end. The sound of it rolled across the compound, across the plains beyond, a tide of grief audible for miles. I stood near the kitchens with the other slaves, watching in numb horror as the Hunnic world tore itself apart. The physician muttered prayers in Greek beside me. The Roman engineer had gone pale, his hands shaking. We knew that we stood on the edge of catastrophe, that if this grief turned to rage, if the Huns needed blood to balance the loss of their king, we would be the first to die. The body was taken to the great hall and laid upon a bier in the center of the floor. Warriors filed past, each one cutting himself anew, each one howling his grief to the smoke-blackened rafters. The subject kings came too, Ardaric the Gepid with his retinue, Valamir, who led the Ostrogoths, chieftains of the Sirai and Rugi, and a dozen other peoples whose names I barely knew. They paid their respects with careful faces, and I wondered what they truly felt. Relief, perhaps, beneath the mask of sorrow, fear of what came next. Attila had ruled them with a fist of iron, extracting tribute and warriors, and absolute obedience. Now that fist was opened in death, and the future was uncertain. Elak, Attila's eldest son, stood at the head of the bier with his brothers Dengizich and Ernak flanking him. Even in grief, I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was the heir, the one who would claim his father's title and empire, or so he believed. But the Hunnic succession was not like Rome's, where law and precedent governed the transfer of power. Among the steppe peoples, kingship went to the strong, and strength had to be proven. Ellak was watching the subject kings, measuring their loyalty, counting the warriors who might follow him against those who might defect. His brothers watched him in turn, and I saw in their faces the same hunger, the same ambition. The empire was already fracturing, and Attila had been dead less than a day. They mourned him for 3 days and nights without ceasing. The body remained in the great hall, surrounded by torches that burned day and night, filling the air with acrid smoke. Warriors took turns standing vigil, chanting the old songs of the steppe, tales of conquest and glory, of ancestors who rode with the wind and drank from the skulls of their enemies. The chanting was hypnotic, a rhythmic drone that wormed into the mind and would not leave. I slept badly those 3 nights, waking from dreams of blood and fire to find the chanting still echoing through the compound. On the second day, they brought out Attila's horses, his finest stallions, the ones he rode to war, and sacrificed them on the plain before the palace. The animals' throats were cut with ceremony. Their blood poured into the earth as offering to the sky god and the spirits of war. I watched from a distance as the great bodies collapsed, legs kicking in death throes, and I thought of all the men and women and children who had died at Attila's command over the years. How many Roman cities burned? How many villages put to the sword? How many slaves dragged in chains across the Danube, never to see home again? The horses' blood soaked into the ground, and I felt nothing but emptiness. As for Ildiko, she disappeared into a guarded yurt, and I did not see her again during those days of mourning. Rumor said Ellak had taken custody of her, that he was deciding her fate. Some claimed he would have her executed as a murderess. Others insisted the Greek physician's testimony had saved her, that she would be returned to her people. I heard a slave woman say that Ildiko had not spoken since the morning they found Attila dead, that she sat mute and staring, refusing food, wasting away with grief or shock. I did not know which rumors to believe. I knew only that I feared for her, this girl who shared my Gothic blood and had become the focus of 1,000 whispered accusations. On the 3rd night, they held the burial. This was done in secret, with only a chosen few permitted to witness. I was not among them. Slaves were excluded from the sacred rites. But I heard the preparations and saw the procession depart as dusk fell. They had fashioned a triple coffin for Attila's body, innermost of gold, beaten thin and worked with images of his conquests. Middle layer of silver, thick and heavy, sealed with lead. Outermost of iron, as befitted a warrior king. Into the coffins they placed treasures beyond counting, gold from Roman tribute, jeweled weapons taken in battle, silk and precious stones, and artifacts plundered from 100 cities. The coffins were loaded onto a wagon draped in black felt, drawn by oxen whose horns had been gilded for the occasion. The procession wound out from the palace into the darkness of the plain, torches bobbing like fireflies, the sound of chanting fading into the distance. I stood at the edge of the compound and watched them go, and I thought, this is the end of something. When that coffin goes into the earth, more than a man will be buried. An age, perhaps, a way of life. The old slave woman who cooked our meals told me later what had happened, though she had not witnessed it herself, but heard it from a warrior who drunk too much and talked too freely. They dug the grave somewhere out on the plain. She did not know where, and the warrior would not say, and they lowered the triple coffin into the earth with ropes of silk. They filled the grave and stamped the ground flat, disguising it so that no one could find it again. And then, she said, dropping her voice to a whisper, they killed everyone who had dug the grave and attended the burial. 100 men, perhaps more, slaughtered beside the hidden tomb so that the secret of Attila's resting place would die with them. The Huns did not want grave robbers desecrating their king's remains, did not want enemies despoiling the treasures that accompanied him to the afterlife. So they murdered the witnesses and left their bodies for the wolves. I felt sick hearing this, though I knew I should not be surprised. The Huns were capable of any cruelty, if they believed it served a purpose. Still, the image haunted me. 100 men lying dead on the dark plain, their blood soaking into the same earth that held their king's golden coffin, all of them silenced forever to guard a secret that would be forgotten within a generation. Some said they had diverted the Tisza river, burying Attila in the riverbed before letting the waters return to their course. Others claimed the grave was in a hidden valley in the mountains, or beneath a barrow on the open steppe. I never learned the truth. Perhaps no one living knows it now. On the fourth day, the mourning ended as abruptly as it had begun. The warriors washed the blood from their faces, bound up their self-inflicted wounds, and gathered in the great hall for a council that would decide the future of the empire. I was called to attend as translator, for the subject kings spoke a babel of languages, and Elac wanted no misunderstandings. I stood against the wall and watched as the sons of Attila faced the rulers of the Germanic peoples their father had conquered. The tension in the hall was palpable, thick as smoke. Elac sat in the high seat that had been his father's, Dengizich and Ernak on either side. Before them stood Ardaric of the Gepids, Valamir of the Ostrogoths, and a dozen other kings and chieftains whose peoples had been yoked to Hunnic service for 20 years. Elac spoke first, in Hunnic, and I translated his words into Gothic and Latin for those who needed it. He declared that he was now king of the Huns, inheritor of his father's empire, and that the subject peoples would render to him the same tribute and obedience they had rendered to Attila. His voice was hard, brooking no disagreement, and I could see he expected immediate submission. But Ardaric did not bow. The Gepid king stood with his arms crossed and his face impassive, and when he spoke, his voice was measured and cold. Attila was a great man, he said in Gothic, which I rendered into Hunnic for Elac's benefit. I followed him because he earned my loyalty through strength and wisdom. You are not your father. You have not led us in battle. You have not proven yourself worthy of the high seat. Why should we follow you? A murmur ran through the hall, shock from the Huns, approval from some of the Germanic kings. Elac's face darkened with rage. He stood, one hand on the hilt of his sword, and for a moment I thought he would strike Ardaric down where he stood. But Dengizich laid a hand on his brother's arm, restraining him, and Elac mastered himself with visible effort. "You dare question me," he said through gritted teeth. "My father conquered your people. You are tributary kings, servants of the Huns. You will obey, or you will be destroyed." Ardaric smiled, a thin, dangerous expression. "Your father is dead," he said, "and you are not him." The council dissolved into chaos. The subject kings began arguing among themselves in a dozen languages while the Huns shouted them down, and Elac raged from the high seat. I translated frantically, trying to keep up with the torrent of accusations and demands, but it was hopeless. The hall was coming apart. The careful structure of power that Attila had maintained through force of personality and ruthless violence crumbling before my eyes. Valamir the Ostrogoth stepped forward and raised a hand for silence. He was younger than Ardaric, a warrior in his prime, and he commanded respect even from the Huns. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the din. "We have all lost a great king. Let us not dishonor his memory with unseemly quarrels. Elac has a claim to leadership. He is Attila's eldest son, but so do his brothers. And so, in truth, do we all. The empire was built on the strength of many peoples, not the Huns alone. Perhaps it is time to acknowledge that." Elac looked at him with eyes like chips of ice. "You suggest we divide the empire, parcel it out like land among farmers. Never. The Huns rule. That will not change." "Then you will rule alone," Ardaric said quietly, "for I will not follow you." He turned and walked from the hall, his Gepid warriors falling in behind him. Other kings looked at each other, uncertainty written on their faces, and then, one by one, they too turned and left. Valamir went last, pausing at the door to look back at Elac with something like pity. "Your father held us through strength," he said. "You have only inherited his title, not his power. Prove yourself, and we may yet follow. But until then," he shrugged and walked out into the daylight. The hall emptied until only the Huns remained. Elac stood trembling with rage, his brothers silent beside him, and I knew with terrible certainty that war was coming. The empire was fracturing, the subject peoples rising against their masters, and there would be blood and fire before any new order emerged. I was dismissed and fled gratefully to the slave quarters, my mind reeling. That night, lying on my pallet while the others slept, I thought about Ildiko alone in her guarded yurt. I thought about Attila dying in a pool of his own blood, choking in drunken stupor, while his beautiful bride watched helpless. I thought about the empire he had built through savagery and cunning, now tearing itself apart mere days after his death. And I thought about the grave out on the plain, hidden beneath earth or water, guarded by the corpses of the men who dug it. A monument to power that would be forgotten, lost, erased from the world like wind-blown sand. In the end, that is what came to pass. Within the year, the empire of the Huns collapsed completely. But I run ahead of myself. Let me record what I witnessed, what I heard, before time and rumor corrupt the truth beyond recognition. The rebellion came in the spring of the following year, 454 by the Roman reckoning, and it came with a violence that shocked even those of us who had lived through years of Hunnic warfare. Ardaric the Gepid had spent the winter gathering allies among the subject peoples, forging a coalition of Goths and Rugi and Skiri and Heruli, all the Germanic tribes that Attila had conquered and yoked to his service. They were done with Hunnic overlordship. Attila had commanded their loyalty through genius and terror, but his sons were ordinary men, cruel and grasping without their father's brilliance. The subject kings chose freedom, even if it meant war. The armies met at a place called Nadau, somewhere in Pannonia, along a river whose name I never learned with certainty. I was not there. Slaves and non-combatants remained behind at the palace, guarded by a skeleton force of warriors too old or too young for the battle line. But we heard the reports when the survivors came straggling back weeks later. The Gepids and their allies crushed the Huns, crushed them utterly. Elac died in the fighting, cut down by Gothic swords while trying to rally his fleeing warriors. Thousands of Huns fell in a single day, their bodies heaped in the river until the water ran red and the stench of death hung over the valley for weeks. The survivors fled eastward, back toward the steppes from which their ancestors had come generations before. Dengisich and Ernak escaped the slaughter, the youngest sons, less arrogant than Elac, wise enough to retreat when the battle turned against them. But their authority was broken. The empire was finished. In the aftermath, the Germanic peoples carved up the territory that Attila had ruled. Ardaric took lands for the Gepids along the Danube. Valamir led the Ostrogoths to independence in Pannonia. The Rugi and Skiri claimed their own territories. The Hunnic people themselves fragmented into squabbling clans, some accepting service under their former subjects, others retreating to the eastern steppes to resume the nomadic life their ancestors had known. A few continued to raid Roman territory for another generation. I heard that Dengisich led attacks across the Danube as late as 468, before the Romans captured and beheaded him. But they were remnants, ghosts of the terror that Attila had embodied. Within 20 years of his death, the Huns had vanished from history as a significant power, absorbed into other peoples or scattered beyond memory. I remained at the palace through that first terrible year, too valuable as a translator to be casually killed, too enslaved to flee. I watched the compound empty as warriors departed for Nadau and did not return. I saw Elac's body brought back on a litter, his face peaceful in death, almost relieved, as if he had welcomed the release from an impossible burden. I saw Dengisich and Ernak quarrel over the remnants of their father's kingdom, each claiming authority neither truly possessed, until finally they agreed to divide what little remained and went their separate ways. And I saw Ildiko, briefly, in the chaos after Nadau, when the guards who had watched her simply vanished, and she emerged from her confinement like a wraith. She was thin, her hair lank, her eyes hollow with whatever she had endured in that year of captivity. We spoke once, two Goths among the ruins of the Hunnic Empire, and she told me in a voice like dead leaves that she had not killed Attila, that she had woken to find him choking and dying, and had tried to turn him, to clear his airway. But the blood kept coming, and he would not wake, and then it was too late. She had covered herself in his blood trying to save him, and they had called her murderess for it. I was 17, she said, staring at nothing. I did not even know his language. I did not want to be his wife, but I did not kill him. I believed her. I believe her still, writing this years later in a monastery far from the plains where Attila ruled and died. The Greek physician was right. A nosebleed worsened by excessive drink, a drunken man lying on his back unable to rouse, blood flowing into the throat and lungs until breath stopped. No poison, no blade, no witchcraft. Just the stupid, meaningless chance that ends lives regardless of power or glory. Attila the Hun, Scourge of God, terror of the world, died because his nose bled and he was too drunk to turn his head. There is no justice in it, no cosmic meaning, only the grim comedy of mortal existence. I asked Ildiko what she would do. She said she would try to return to her people, if any of them still lived. I never saw her again after that day. Perhaps she made it home. Perhaps she died on the road, another anonymous victim of the chaos that consumed those years. I do not know. And I have learned to accept that there are things I will never know. As for myself, I was eventually freed when the palace was abandoned and the remaining Huns dispersed. I made my way south to Roman territory, starving and desperate, and found refuge at last in a monastery in Moesia, where a kindly abbot took pity on a literate Goth who knew languages and could read and write. I have lived here for 15 years now, copying manuscripts and teaching young monks, and I count myself fortunate beyond measure. But I have never forgotten what I witnessed on the Tisza plain in the year 453. I have never forgotten the smell of blood in that bridal chamber, the sound of Ildiko's weeping, the sight of Attila's purple face staring at nothing. I have never forgotten the warriors cutting their faces in grief, or the triple coffin lowered into a secret grave, or the council where the empire came apart in shouts and recrimination. I have never forgotten that power, however absolute it seems, is as fragile as a man's life, that empires rise and fall on the chance of a nosebleed, a moment of drunkenness, a failure to turn one's head. The Romans speak of Attila still, though he has been dead these 15 years. They call him the Scourge of God, and they tell stories of his cruelty and his conquests, of cities burned and peoples enslaved. They say he was a demon sent to punish Christian sin, and that God struck him down when his purpose was fulfilled. I have heard a different story from travelers, that the Eastern Emperor Marcian had a dream the night Attila died, a vision of a broken bow lying on the ground, and woke, knowing that the Hunnic threat had ended. The Christians see divine providence in everything. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps God did strike Attila down. Or perhaps it was simply the frailty of flesh, the inevitable failing of the body that comes to all men, king and slave alike. I do not pretend to know the mind of God. I know only what I saw. I write this account so that future generations might have some record closer to truth than the legends that already obscure these events. I write it because I was there, because I stood in Attila's court and translated his words and watched his empire crumble, and because I believe that history deserves more than myths and propaganda. The truth is this: Attila the Hun died in a room that smelled of wine and blood, choked on the flow from his own nose, while too drunk to save himself. And his beautiful bride watched him die and could do nothing to prevent it. His sons quarreled over his legacy and lost it to rebellion. His empire, built on terror and tribute, collapsed within a year. His grave is lost, its location murdered into silence, along with the men who dug it, and the peoples he conquered, Goths and Gepids and Ostrogoths and all the rest, won their freedom and built kingdoms of their own on the ruins of his dominion. There is no glory in this story, no heroic ending. Only the reminder that all men die, that all empires fall, and that the greatest conqueror in the world can be brought low by something as small and stupid as a nosebleed in the night. I am old now. My hands shake when I hold the pen, and my eyes grow dim. I will not live to see what becomes of these lands in the years ahead. The Goths and Gepids will fight among themselves, no doubt, and new powers will rise to fill the vacuum that Attila left. The Romans will endure, or they will fall. Who can say? The wheel of history turns regardless of our wishes. But I have written what I witnessed, and I have done it honestly, without embellishment or invention. Let this account stand as testimony. Let it speak for those who died and those who survived, for Attila and Ildiko, and all the nameless thousands whose lives were consumed by the machinery of empire. I was Jordanes, a Gothic slave, who learned to read and write and translate, who stood in the presence of the world's terror and lived to record his end. I was there when the Scourge of God choked on his own blood and died in the arms of a weeping girl. I saw the empire of the Huns come apart like smoke in the wind, and I have written it down so that you might know the truth of how the mighty fall, how power dissolves, how the great wheel of history crushes all beneath it, regardless of glory or fame or the pretensions of immortality. This is my testimony. This is what I witnessed. May God have mercy on us all. The fire burns low, the voice falls silent. Rest now, the history remains.